with the showing of the deck, if that's okay. That's good.
Yeah,
Thank
that's
you.
perfect.
And thanks for your patience with us there. So everyone, welcome back. Or if you are again new to the conference, just check those audio settings. Computer audio is the one to hear us loud and clear. And as always, drop us a question. We're here to interact. I want to hear from you. So, Francis and Gemma, I'm going to hand over straight to you to introduce yourselves, and you're going to take us through to around about 12. So yeah, thanks so much for joining us, and over to you guys.
Hello. Thank you for bearing with us while we made sure that we had the right slide deck. And apologies if this is a bit of a strange session, because it's the first time I've done a webinar where I've not been able to see people's faces or know how to respond. So I have no idea if you're enjoying it or not, but hopefully we can use the kind of chat function effectively and try and make this as useful as possible for everyone here. So just to explain a bit about who we are, my name's Gemma. I am co-founder, so started the company Schoolspace and still director of Schoolspace. I've been working at Schoolspace for 9 years now, since we started the company. We just had our birthday during lockdown, which was a strange way to celebrate. And Schoolspace is an organisation that works with schools to rent out their spaces. So it just does what it says on the tin. And over the kind of course of 9 years, we haven't changed what we've been doing, which is to rent out facilities on the behalf of schools to the local community. So hopefully that makes us qualified to give you a little bit of guidance as to how to run lettings effectively yourself. And what we're going to be doing in this webinar is talking a bit about how you can do that in-house. So Schoolspace is an outsourced option. I'm just going to explain a little bit how that works so that you get an idea of who we are and how we operate. But this webinar is intended to give you guys the guidance to make the decision as to whether you run lettings in-house, and also hopefully to improve your lettings if you're already running them. And we're going to use the question box and the chat box throughout, and we've kind of planned this so it works if we have that awkward thing on so many webinars where no one asks any questions. But it also is totally open for you guys to ask questions, because if there's one thing we've learned from running lettings is that every school is different, and you will all be in different situations with your lettings provision. So a little bit about Schoolspace. So we started the company back in 2011 with the aim of doing a few things. So there are kind of three things we aim to do as a company for schools. One is to make them money, which is often why people will speak to us, or why we'll start the conversation about lettings, because as we know, school budget cuts and just the desire to kind of provide the best provision for your kids and balance that budget means that you are looking for alternative ways to generate income, of which lettings, when done correctly, is one of the best. So we do exist as a company to make money for schools, and the way that we do that is we operate on a revenue share basis. So we'll rent out the facilities to the community, we'll charge the local people to come in and run their karate sessions or whatever that might be, and we'll take a cut to cover our costs, and then the school will make a percentage of revenue as well. The second thing that we do is to reduce hassle for schools. So if you guys are mostly business managers or head teachers or whatever role you play within your school, if you start lettings, one of the main things that you will say about it is a headache and a big drain on time, whoever is in charge of it. And we also look to try and take that time off your hands. So we're a fully managed service, which means that the whole operation is outsourced to us, because we recognise that running lettings in-house can become more than a full-time job, and we exist to try and remove some of that hassle. And then the third thing that we do is connect schools to the local community. So we're really keen on the idea that letting should be about income generation, but it's also a really great way to engage with your local community, become a community hub, and also to market your school, whether that's to prospective students or parents. So that's just a whistle-stop tour of what we do. As I said, I'm co-founder and director, sit more on kind of the school engagement side, so hopefully I'm well placed to kind of answer any questions. And Frances is our business development director, and she works to kind of manage end-to-end the sales process. So she will have spoken to a lot of schools about starting lettings, convince them to come and use our service, but she will also deal with our customer sales team. So she's responsible for really growing lettings. So she's a real expert on kind of how we bring up the volume of lettings in each school that we work with, and we'll be able to answer anything on kind of the customer side there as well. One thing I'm very conscious of is that is it all right, Frances, if you change the slides? Is that something that you're able to do?
I don't have control. I think.
So I just say next slide, please, if that works.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, so if we go next slide, please, because this is just about Schoolspace, our service. Our company
Again,
would go to the next slide, because this is just stuff we've been rolling in the background. If we keep going to the next one as well, that's the 3 things we do for schools. This is what we do for customers. If you keep going, great. So that's where we'll stop for now. So you can put questions in the box at any time, because as we know, lettings kind of operate differently for everyone. But what we would like to start with doing is just understanding kind of where you guys are at in your stages of lettings. So we've given out a checklist, which you should all have access to, but that's intended more as a takeaway tool and to prompt any questions. So don't worry too much about that. You don't need it by your side for the webinar. But what we would like to understand is where you sit on this. So we're going to structure the webinar going through different stages. So the first being preparing for lettings. So if you're in this category, it's normally that you either haven't tried lettings before, or so you don't rent out your school at all, be that because your head teacher decided not to, or you decided it wasn't worth it, or you simply don't think you've got the right facilities. So you're just looking at kind of dipping a toe in, or maybe you've got a few lettings, but they're not really kind of thought about actively. So that's what we would say is stage 1. So looking at preparing for lettings and getting the grounding right. Stage 2 is kind of setting up lettings and making them professionalized is maybe the right word. So perhaps you've got a few lettings, they've come in over the years, there's a lot of built up agreements which might be from a predecessor, or it might be something that you've kind of thought about on the side, but you haven't necessarily got what you would call a lettings program, and that's what we would call launching lettings. So we're going to talk a little bit about kind of if you're trying to really manage that in a kind of planned way, this is what we would argue that you need to set up. Obviously, if you've done stage 1, you would then move on to stage 2. And then stage 3 is really kind of that secondary thought process, which again, lots of business managers and head teachers don't have time to do. But if you do want to kind of make lettings really work for you, it's stage 3, which is making lettings profitable. So looking about how you can really maximize the kind of, if you've got already got a lettings program that you feel is running quite well, but here's some additional tips to kind of really stretch that, or really make sure that you have some goals that are set out for lettings and you've got the tools to do that. So what we would really like everyone to do is comment in the chat box or the question box, depending on which works best for people, just to say which stage they think they're at, just by putting 1, 2 and 3 in the box, and that will give us a really good understanding of kind of what we should focus more on there. So I'm just going to let hopefully people comment in the chat box and put through. I'm just going to hope that I'll be able to see that. I can't see any comments yet. I don't know, Francis, you can see any?
No, not currently.
And Katie, I don't know if you want to type in 1, 2 or 3 just to make sure that we can see it if people do.
Yep, I think it's just refreshing itself. I haven't been able to see anything come through at the moment. Oh, I can see a 1 from
Lovely,
Ian.
thank you for the person being the first brave person to let us know. We're obviously not going to pick on anyone, but we just want to understand a little bit about the makeup of the audience. So please don't feel shy. I can't see.
Anybody else want to pop a comment in? Oh, and we've had, oh, and another 1 as well. So a couple of 1s.
There's a mix 1 and 2.
Great.
Somebody saying a number of lettings, very historic, but these are growing after netball refurb and want to make a move, make more of it.
Lovely. Okay, so we'll maybe make more of being in stage 1 and 2 than we will 3. We'll whistle through number 3.
Yeah.
I can't see people commenting on that, so I don't know if it's in the questions box or whether, Francis, you can see them.
No, I can just see the chat that we've had with organisers. So if there's a way for us to see that chat, that would be really, really great if Aquila could share that with us.
If not, you're going to have to keep telling us what the questions are, I'm afraid, guys.
Yeah, if not, Katie, if you could shout out, that'd be awesome.
We will, of course.
Lovely. Okay, so the way that we're going to structure this is going through each stage and basically just running through some of the things that you should be thinking about. So you can either take notes or, as we have said, I think this may have gone out in the literature, we have provided a checklist, which is kind of a takeaway and is in the handout section here. And also we are offering kind of as one of the freebies, a kind of free consultation. So if anything here, you're like, oh, I don't know how to use this, or I don't know how to practically use this, you can either ask a question or we can arrange a follow-up. So please don't stress too much if this feels like there's too much information. what else did I say I was going to mention? Yeah, so we're going to run through each stage, and then we're going to use effectively a case study so that we can kind of illustrate what this looks like. But if you ask a question during the stage, then that will give us kind of, we'll leave some place for questions at each one. Okay.
Yeah, and if Katie, if you could just shout if there are any questions, that'd be really great.
We'll leave space at the end of each section.
Yeah.
Cool. And then the last point I'm going to make is that we are going to make this generic. So we are really conscious that, as I said, every school is different, but also lettings can be quite different from secondaries to primaries. If you're a local authority school, an academy school, or you're within a diocese academy trust, if you're a rural school or an urban school, but some things do remain the same. So we've tried to make this kind of something that will apply for everyone. Okay, so if we could go on to the next stage, I'm going to let Frances kick off with stage 1, preparing for lettings.
Beautiful. So here I'm just going to run through all the things that you need to think about when you're thinking about, is lettings for us? Is it the right thing? How can we really practically make it work? So I think that can be quite daunting sometimes, but actually also hopefully the checklist and what we can run through today will make it easy for you to cover those things off, and actually kind of easy to identify the areas where you can really easily pick up some lettings as well. So probably the number one thing is looking at what are your suitable spaces in your school. Most commonly, these are main halls, sports halls, conference rooms, anything that can be used for multi-purpose use is going to be your best spots for lettings. The reason for that is if you think about the customers that you can bring into those spaces, the more different types of customers you can imagine going into that space, the better you're going to do on lettings. So if you have a really niche room, so say a food tech room is a good example of this, you may well be able to find a customer that matches that really well. That's going to be more difficult than a sports hall where you have every sport under the sun that can go in there. Classrooms can definitely be used for lettings, but one thing I will say is if you're going to do that, make sure that it's a classroom-based activity happening in the classroom. A good example of a space that is generally not great for lettings are, for example, nurseries or reception classrooms if you're a primary school, just because, to be honest, they have a lot of stuff in them that like doesn't want to be moved or like could be played with. So those are areas that normally we leave be, and generally most schools have lots of other spaces. So that's your kind of first area to think about. What are the spaces that you're going to include in your lettings? The second thing, which is super practical, is your cleaning. So obviously, if your customers are going to be coming in the afternoon, you want them to come into a clean space. So how does your cleaning run? Is it in the morning or evening? What orders does it go in? And just being aware that obviously you're not going to want to be able to not run lettings because you have a cleaner in or for those to clash. So you might need to do a bit of a reroute, and you can work with your site manager or your cleaners on that. Thirdly, school use. So obviously schools are ultimately your spaces, and then lettings are kind of a secondary to that. So if there are areas of your school that are, say, every Thursday used for lettings, you need to think, sorry, for school use. So you have a meeting in there every single Thursday. You need to think about the fact that therefore you can't run lettings in that area, and also what that looks like in terms of access. So just being considerate of what this might look like, or even where your teachers might tend to work in the evenings, and thinking about how that can fit around lettings so you don't start something up and then quite quickly hit a wall block because everything's clashing and going against each other. Another one for secondaries here is obviously exams, and just thinking about how they and the kind of setup of your halls might be affected. So access and toilet use, again, this is probably quite obvious, but just something to think about is how do you access each of those spaces that you've designated for lettings? So you've looked at your school, you said these are the 5 spaces we're going to let, then you should probably pick up a site map and look at how do you actually access those spaces. The big flag here is if you have 2 spaces, say you have a main hall with a drama studio at the back, and the only way to access that drama studio is through the main hall, you're not going to want to be letting those 2 spaces at the same time, but for different groups, because they're going to be crossing over. And that's a bad customer experience and also could cause some safeguarding issues. So in that case, you think about, well, which is my better let to run, and have someone making that decision. And then also, obviously, the toilets that people are using, preferably every customer will have a different toilet, but you need to kind of think about that one and just dedicate them in. And the other thing to think of here is, you know, areas that you can block off in the school, and even just simply like leading customers through a certain route. so that they're not, you know, going exploring, because they've been shown lots and lots of different ways. So what we tend to do is draw a site map and also draw the access routes through. So we know that if a customer is going here, this is the route that they will always take, and just keeping that consistent. I've touched on this, but obviously safeguarding is really key for lettings. And probably one of the biggest decisions you need to make at the beginning in terms of safeguarding is what time that you will start lettings from. So we refer to this as a handover time, as in you're handing over from the school to lettings. And essentially this is the moment that the school goes from being a place where you know that every adult on site is DBS checked, or all visitors are accompanied by somebody who is DBS checked, or a site staff, to knowing that actually there are going to be adults on site and potentially kids on site that are not DBS checked. So that crossover might happen. So what we're saying here is when lettings begin, essentially all of your school kids need to be off site, or need to be definitely accompanied and kind of in a certain area to make sure that you don't have any safeguarding concerns. So if there are groups with young children there, they obviously need to be DBS checked as the leaders, but there might be people who have come to go to other classes, you know, a Zumba class, who are not going to be DBS checked. So you need to be aware that they're going to be on your site. So once you've kind of gone through this process of being, okay, like what would lettings look like practically? Where would we put them? Where would we take them? What times would it run? The kind of final thing is just to think about who's going to manage it. And Gemma will actually go into this in much more detail, but just starting to think about, okay, who has that capacity, who has that ability, and who's going to be that front of house person that are talking to people all the time. And that kind of covers off your first section. So if there are any, I know a lot of you are number one, so if there are any questions, please throw them out there. If not, we can talk a little bit more about that safeguarding stuff, because that is really key. So Katie, I don't know if you can see any more questions.
Just the main one really that came on was just sort of saying that there's an interest to know about more about marketing facilities. So that's probably a little bit further along, or?
Yeah, so literally the start of stage 2 is marketing. So that's a perfect segue in momentarily.
Perfect segue.
Yeah, ideal. So Gemma, do you want to talk a little about safeguarding first, and then we can go into that marketing?
Yeah, we'll just include a quick case study for stage 1, because this is a school that we worked with, and it's something that might kind of prompt a few thoughts if you think, oh, that's me, or I'm in that situation. Because as I mentioned previously, we are aware that some of you might be inheriting things from predecessors. So even if you considered all of this before you started, you might have inherited arrangements where you need to go back and do this preparing for lettings again. So we've got an example of a school that we work with in London, where they had kind of a lettings provision that was fairly active, and from a safeguarding perspective we went in and did this audit, and there were kind of 2 main issues that they had as a school. One was that they were actually a school in quite a high gang. There was a lot of gang problems in the area, and they were therefore allowing their sixth form students to work at the school quite late, actually until about 7 p.m, to work in the library, so that they didn't have to go home during the peak times, because that was causing a problem with these students. So very specific to the area, and something that they had accommodated. It's not really that usual, we find, for students to be staying on site that late. And then the second issue was that they had after school clubs that were running until kind of 5-6 p.m, and lettings that were starting at 4 p.m. And that's one of the things that we always encourage schools to think about, is your distinction between what your after school club is and your lettings are. So your after school clubs, particularly if you're a primary school, very common, will be things that are run, might be called enrichment in a secondary, things that are run solely for your students. It might be by teachers, it might be by an out of school provider, but it would only be for your students. You are responsible for their kind of safeguarding and making sure it's still within that safe site, you know, pre-handover time. And it's very much kind of seen as an extension of the school provision. It might also be the same provider as your breakfast club or your holiday camp. We then distinguish after kind of the handover time that's arranged for lettings. You have paying lettings, where there might be lots of people coming in to do karate, or it might be kind of an outside provider that has plenty of people coming in from schools around and will be really open to the public. So what we did with this school was we kind of instilled that. We went through all of the people that were using the school at different times in the afternoon and evening, and said, if you're before 5 p.m, you're an after school club, so you need to be on the school's arrangement there. They need to be responsible for DBS checking and doing everything that way. It's not a letting, they shouldn't be paying us. The school keeps 100% of the income, it's managed by them, and also the school kind of makes sure that everything is being run as it should good and is responsible for that after school club. And then we said that everyone after that time would be a letting, so would need to be coming under kind of paying the same as a paying letting customer. They would need to be doing the same kind of safeguarding arrangements as a lettings customer, and it created that really clear mark and line between which before that time it was after school clubs, after that time it was lettings. There were a couple that ran through that handover time, and we kind of segmented them off. Either they split their sessions into kind of provision just with the school students in after school time, or provision for wider community afterwards as a letting, or we asked them to move their start and end time. What we did with the students that were still on site, which might be an issue for some of you, whether that's frequently or just during exam revision time, is that we said that they would be in a designated locked off area with a different access route and toilets, and ideally supervised by a member of staff. In this situation they were. We recognise that's not always possible with sixth formers, but just that it would be in a separate area, and it was very, very clear that there was a fob access control door between there and where there were people doing Zumba, because otherwise you can end up in a situation where you have your students on site, they're interacting with lettings as if it was a public site, and neither the students nor their parents nor people within the school are really aware that that's a safeguarding risk. So that's just one example of where we've seen this being an issue with schools, and running through this checklist allowed us to kind of flag that and deal with it. So we're going to move on to stage 2 now, and thankfully we've already got a question for the end, but I'm just going to run through, just like Francis did, the different areas. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. That would be great. Right, so we're going to talk about marketing, which is a really common question, so thank you so much to the person that asked this. So we're just going to talk about the basic marketing, and then in stage 3 we'll talk a little bit more about the kind of next tier marketing, because I'm a big believer when schools are starting marketing that you just need to keep it simple. So there are 2 things I'd say. The first is take the easy steps. So people overcomplicate things. They worry about needing to get a marketing expert in, and yes, marketing is, you know, an art that people train in, but it is also something that you can definitely start very easily. So the 2 things I would say are, 1, put a banner on your school gates. You know, all after school clubs will be asking you to do this anyway. You'll probably have put some up for your Ofsted reports and things like that, but we are always shocked at, no matter how much paid marketing we do of any kind of fancy art, a banner on the school gates is always going to be the best way to attract people. So you just put it up saying these facilities are available to hire. We do that with all of our schools. It's something that comes free as part of our service, is marketing, but particularly the banner on school gates. You know, you don't have to have a picture of the facilities, you just need to really say the facilities are available to hire. So just start off with that, and you know, they cost between £50 and £100, and they really are the best way to make everyone aware that you can rent out your facilities. You'll start to get inbound inquiries as soon as you do that, we tend to find, especially if you're on a main road, and think about where you'll get the most foot traffic for that. The second thing is put something on your website. You're going to find that people who, you know of your school existing and, you know, want to be renting facilities are going to be searching online. They'll come to your website, they won't see anything obvious, and they'll struggle to know that they can rent out your facilities. The one thing we'd say is, you know that you haven't put this in the right place on your website if you're still getting people emailing you saying, can I rent out your facilities? Because chances are they've looked at the website, not been able to find the information they were looking for, and used the contact us button anyway. So you need to put it somewhere that's obvious, ideally on the home page, if not under the contact us, or kind of how to find the school, often on the website is the best way. People put it under all sorts of kind of things that they think make most sense, but as a customer you're going to want to see it as soon as you come onto the school site, in the footer, or under how to find us or contact us, because that's where customers will be looking. So those are the 2 things I'd recommend. Simple marketing, you'll get it started, and what we also find is word of mouth travels really quickly. So as soon, you might find it slow to pick up, but as soon as you have a couple of lettings coming in, people will know in the area this is somewhere that you're happy to rent now. It's possible to do so, and hopefully they'll have had a good experience. So marketing kind of does its own work after that. The second kind of element of marketing is, don't make it difficult for people to inquire. So you've done the extra work to make it kind of possible for people to see, but I think what people don't think about when they start marketing the facilities is that if you can put all the effort in to putting a banner up, letting people know that they can rent the facilities, maybe you've used the school newsletter, we'll talk a bit about other options you can use. If someone rings up the main school and your receptionist has no idea that you rent out facilities, or really doesn't quite like lettings because they cause a bit of mess on a Monday morning, if your receptionist says, no, we don't do that, or isn't very kind kind of pro customer service when it comes to people inquiring about lettings, you're going to shut down every inquiry that you've worked so hard to bring in. So make sure that as part of your marketing efforts, you're training the person that picks up the phone and your site team, because that's often where lettings get passed on to, whether you'd like them to or not, just to know what to say and where to direct the inquiry. So whether that's saying, please use this extension, or setting up a new extension on your phone for the school, or whether that's just informing your receptionist that they need to pass the inquiry straight on, and definitely take a number and an email to get back to the customer. I know it's really basic, but we see that that's a massive stop for us, is when we do lots of marketing effort, but we find out that we're not actually getting many inquiries because the receptionist isn't too keen on passing them on, or doesn't know where to. So that's the second thing I'd say. Or sorry, the first thing I'd say under don't make it too difficult for people to inquire. The second thing is make sure that you know where emails should be sent. Either have a dedicated lettings address that reroutes to you if you're managing them, or the person who's managing them, or just making sure that on the website there is a lettings inquiry email, because otherwise it will just go into the generic inbox and again may not get passed on. And then the third thing is to make your pricing clear, because that's the other thing, is that lots of people will ring up and ask about the price, and if you can't give them an immediate answer, it normally causes problems, or it might mean that you have to take 3 weeks to get back to them because you're providing a quote. So I'm going to talk about that next, because it's an important part of launching lettings. So pricing, there are 2 ways to price your facilities. One is based on kind of how much margin you want to make and making sure that each and every lettings work for you. The second is to do it based on kind of the market. We would suggest that starting with the market is the best way to do it. When all schools start with us, we perform a local audit for free. We'll look at all the facilities in the area, make sure that we're pricing appropriately. We suggest you do the same, but keep it as easy as possible. So just basically email your local schools, ask what they're pricing, maybe look up the community centre that might be in the local area, see what they're pricing for their hall. Is it bigger than yours? Is it nicer than yours and newer? And then just do it in very clear multiples of £5 per hour. So you might, by that I mean either £30 or £35, not that you should be charging £5 an hour. So we suggest that you just do an audit of the local area and then make sure that you're pricing your facilities kind of at an affordable rate. It's per hour, and you don't end up with a situation where you have 18 different prices based on whether it's term time, evening and weekend, whether there's VAT included, whether they're paying for insurance, you know, all of these complicated things. You just have a very clear pricing structure. It makes it easy for people to rent the facilities clearly. The other just quick things I'm going to mention with pricing, because I'm conscious of time, is that we need to make sure that you check your VAT implications. You can ask for advice from your local authority, us if you're working with us, or your financial department in your school. If you want to do it yourself, look up VAT Notice 742 online. It's very interesting, but just making sure you're on the right side of that legislation. And making sure that you include setup and clear up time. One of the most common mistakes we see schools making when they're launching lettings is that they don't include charging people for setup and clear up time. So everyone's renting for an hour, but they're actually using 3 hours. So it's really worth paying attention to that. With your payment, just think carefully about how customers will pay. We'd recommend a booking system, which we can talk a little bit about if anyone's interested. We've actually built our own bespoke one, so we've had to kind of develop a software system where people can have their bookings and then it pulls off into an invoice. There are solutions on the market such as School Hire and OpenPlay, which mean that you can do it without having to have an Excel spreadsheet and run your own payments each month. So I'd recommend looking into that and just thinking carefully about how you invoice, how regularly that should be, and making sure it's in advance so you don't end up with lots of bad debt. The next thing to think about is your lettings agreement. So make sure you're covered legally, make sure that your customers are signing something. You'll often have historic agreements. You'll want to bring those up to date. We've drafted some terms, of course, ourselves, and we do kind of offer a template that you can ask for. So do follow up with us if you want that. Your legal department should be able to help. Do not use an old transfer of control agreement. That might be something that some of you remember if you were working with lettings kind of multiple years ago. Those were kind of local authority agreements and they're now redundant. So just be a little bit careful about what you're asking customers to accept. Your vetting, again, we could talk about vetting for the entire webinar. We won't, but you do need to think carefully about what you do want in your school and what you don't, and maybe including a list, again, for the person taking inquiries, so they don't end up with a radical church group or a politically active group that you're not comfortable with using your facilities. So just think carefully about what you're going to flag, how you're going to do that, and what your staff's going to be checking. Insurance, this is a bit of a dark art. Lots of people don't understand what insurance means, including your customers, and it is understandable because it can create a lot of fear. Just make sure you know your responsibilities. The first one is that you need to check with your own insurer that you are insured for running lettings. This should be standard in your policy, but just double check before you rent out to anyone. And then you need to check all of your customers' insurance, their expiry dates, making sure it actually mentions that they're using a venue and that it's the right value. So usually 5 million public liability insurance minimum. I think a lot of people think that insurance is about injury and about making sure that everything's covered under the sun. It's actually just about making sure that if something goes wrong on site, you have something to claim against rather than going after your customer as an individual. It doesn't protect you from something going wrong. It means that if something does go wrong, you have something to claim against and a recourse, and that is why insurance is so important. We can talk more about that if anyone is worried about that or wants to ask a question about it. Staffing, I'm just going to very quickly, we need to make sure that you've thought about your staff to oversee, as Frances mentioned, but particularly that you have caretaking provision, that it works with their contracts and you're not paying a lot of overtime, that you make sure you've got someone around in an emergency, but also someone to provide customer service, because it's very common otherwise that doors get left open, that, you know, if you're relying on your cleaners, they may not be clear that they have to guide the customer to the right place and check in on them. And definitely do not give out keys. If you've got people with key holders agreement, we would encourage you to review those really carefully to make sure that it doesn't invalidate your insurance, and just making sure that you have kind of people on backup and on call if there's something going wrong in the facilities while the customer's there, for example, the heating breaks or something like that. Okay, so I've whistled through that, but we're still really behind on time. So are there any questions on stage 2? And then we'll be really speedy on stage 3.
Not so much as anything come through. I think it's more of a generic question at the end, so I'll let you keep going if that's okay.
Perfect. I think if it's okay, I'm just going to kind of really quickly summarise what stage 3 is, as we don't have anybody that's kind of flagged at their stage 3. And there's kind of 2 main things here, and we can, if anyone is at this stage or thinks they might be close to this stage, we can have our call and talk about that separately. The 2 main things are calculating utilisation. There is a few slides on here and that I can share with other people as well about how to do that. And that's basically understanding what you can get out of each space in terms of hours and money and where you're at now. So essentially what your capability of your school, what you could make. So that can be really, really useful for making an argument for lettings, for budgeting, for understanding kind of how good you're doing, or how well you're doing at the moment. So if anyone kind of would like to know where they're at, I'm really happy to spend some time with people after this and talk them through. The second thing I wanted to touch on very quickly was just the benefits in kind. I know at the beginning someone mentioned they had a netball group. And again, without knowing the ins and outs, I can't speak specifically to that, but it is very, very common that schools have benefits in kind. And by this I mean you have a group that provides you with a free service, or free as it seems, in return for you giving them use of space, use of equipment, or a massively discounted rate. We've worked with this a lot, and I have a good example actually about a cricket group. But really what you want to be careful of there is making sure that you fully understand the value of the benefit that you're receiving. So if it's use of equipment, how much is that equipment worth? If it's time that they're giving you in terms of coaching, how much is that coaching time worth? And then understanding what are you giving them in return. And that includes all of this kind of seepage that can happen. So they might say that they use your school for an extra hour, but actually they then do put down for another hour. Or they think that they can be the only netball group that work in your school, so you're giving them exclusivity, which is actually potentially limiting your potential. Or they're doing a lot of storage in your school, so they're kind of clogging that area up as well. So I would kind of really advise anybody that does have benefits in kind running at the moment, and who are interested in increasing their income through lettings, just take a really, really close look at what currently that agreement is, and also making sure it all gets written down. So the hours of use are written down, what they're giving you in return is written down, storage use is written down, so it can't kind of seep in and then affect when you do want to push up your lettings or you do have another inquiry. It's not that you have to say no to that because your current customer isn't quite fitting within the realms that they want to, or you want them to. So we've been asked a question which is about preparing for reopening of spaces and kind of the advice that allows them to. So Gemma, I don't know if you want to start on this.
Yeah, so I assume this is in relation to COVID. So we've obviously been going through this. There isn't a lot of information out from the government, or rather as much as we would like. Actually, they released some guidance yesterday about reopening community centres, which we think is kind of the closest for schools. What we understand at the moment is that you can reopen spaces for outdoor usage, obviously within 6 people, and that you can also open for summer camps, because that falls under the government kind of want and need to get students kind of having that outdoor and indoor provision. So you can open up for summer camps. So that's kind of what we understand, and then we think that it's likely that from September, potentially earlier from the government, but likely practicalities are it will be from September, that we'll be allowing indoor lettings again. In terms of reopening, kind of preparing for that, I would just be communicating with your customers as much as possible, just to make sure that they don't go elsewhere and that they know that you've got it in hand. Thinking really carefully about your cleaning. As I said, there's some government advice that I've actually got it open, I can look at what it's called. But basically there's some government advice that's specifically about community centres, which I'd encourage you to look at, which details kind of what cleaning needs to be done, particularly with toilets. And then I think really carefully about access routes, how you're going to encourage people to wear masks and social distance, and just making sure that you can kind of keep lettings where they should be, and also things like making sure that the toilets are regularly cleaned, and that you've got hand sanitizer. But lots of the things that you're already thinking about with your students should kind of cover off these things, and government guidance can kind of do the rest.
Yeah. And then just the other question was about where we're based and where we cover. So we're based in, gone?
No, it's all right, you go.
I can say, so actually I'm currently in London and Gemma's currently in Oxford, which lovely represents where we're based. And we work across the kind of London South area currently.
But we are happy to offer guidance to any school. So
yeah,
if you would like a further consultation, just to, we're a social enterprise and our aim is to help schools. So if there's anything you're worried about, we're more than happy to spend the time to kind of give you some guidance.
Yeah. And on that, I just direct you. So in the handout section of kind of chat, there is a lettings checklist in there. That has my details in. So you're welcome to email me and we can organise a call and go through that. Or you're welcome to email just questions out. As Gemma said, we are a social enterprise. So yes, it's part of my job to kind of do the things that Gemma described, which is work with schools who we work with, but also to give that advice to people and make sure that you're making the most out of your school spaces. Are there any final questions? I think we have 1 minute-ish.
Ladies, I haven't seen any other questions come in, but I really do appreciate that you've shared a link as well, which will make sure it does go out with all the information that goes out afterwards, because of some really helpful advice provided, and obviously your deck. I just wondered if you've got any sort of anything that you wish to just round up, top tips, final thoughts. Put you on the
spot. Just basically, be careful, do things as simply as you can, and think really carefully about the next stage when you're starting. So I think what we often see with schools is that, particularly because we're often called in to outsource when things are going wrong, is that there hasn't been that kind of preparation for what happens next. And it's really common that you pick up predecessors situations, and it's also really common that with your full-time jobs things can go wrong. So it's definitely not a criticism. We see all sorts of things going wrong with lettings, so just taking the time to go through that checklist and considering the next stage and how you can avoid common problems like bad debts and safeguarding risks, kind of bookings causing more of a hassle than they're worth, and just kind of defining that before you get too far stuck in. So making sure that you're really taking the time to think beforehand, what do I want and what don't I want from lettings, and making sure that they work for you, because there's a big difference between having one £30,000 customer who's making all the money that they should be and very respectful and works for you, and having 10 groups paying £3 a year who are causing you huge amounts of problems and making your life a living hell. So please do let us know if there's anything we can do to kind of guide you in the right way of doing lettings, because there definitely is an easy way and a hard way.
Yeah, and I just follow that up by, it's completely fine to take it at your own pace. This doesn't need to go from 0 to 100 in 6 months. There is a learning curve to go through, and we're lucky in that we've gone through that years and years ago, and now we can just step in. But for every school, if you're doing it by yourself, it can be a kind of slow and gradual up. So the income from lettings can be extremely powerful in helping schools to fund extracurricular and all sorts of other things. So it's completely worth it. And so please don't feel kind of nervous to do it. Just take it at your own pace and use people like us to give you the advice.
Thank you. And I thought it was a really good comment to do a bit of market research and stuff. Quite often that's very friendly market research, isn't it? Pick up the phone, ask others. We're all one sector and we all want to share advice. So it doesn't always have to be cloak and dagger. It can be a bit more of a what can we learn together. Serving the community as well. So thank you so much both. That's been absolutely fantastic. You've provided us with lots of resources, as I've said, so we will make sure that those are shared on. We really appreciate your time this afternoon. Well, just close to this afternoon. So audience, we're going to stay on this link because we're now moving on to the 12 o'clock session very shortly, which will be with Lynn Kennedy, who's the HR Director at Altair, who's going to be talking about employee wellbeing post-COVID. So once again, thank you very much to Francis and Gemma, and we'll be touching base with you both soon. All the best. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.